For more on the European Union's corruption concerns, we welcome political scientist and Professor Stephen Fish of the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome to BizAsiaAmerica, sir. So corruption exists everywhere. I think we can agree on that. But this seems to be a very critical report on Europe. Are you surprised?
I'm not surprised. Corruption does depend to a large extent on overall level of development. So around the world, developing countries tend to have higher corruption than developed countries. But even in developed countries, even in Europe, the richest area of the world in many ways, the richest geographical area of the world, corruption is still rife. The type of corruption we have in advanced industrialized countries like the United States or Europe tends to be a little bit different. For example, the European Commission's report talked about the revolving door policy that one finds in Germany. We have the same problem in the United States. It's a different kind of corruption than you might see where voters are being paid for their votes directly, which you get more in developing countries, but it's corruption nevertheless. And it's good to see the European Commission take this on frontally and acknowledge the fact with this study that there are corruption problems even in rich countries.
So I guess there is an issue here, because if the corruption accusations are against politicians and it's up to politicians most likely to solve this problem in their respective countries, it's probably not likely to be resolved anytime soon. Am I right?
It's not going to be resolved definitively and completely anywhere, but to the extent that ordinary citizens in democracies who do have the right to vote and the right to hold their governments accountable where we've got the vote, do insist that our politicians reduce corruption, it can happen. In any democracy, we are going to get the government to some extent that we deserve. And if we are really intent, we ordinary citizens, on reducing levels of corruption, we can reward politicians who engage in less corrupt practices and get the ones who are more corrupt out of power at the ballot box. That said, it's a very slow process. Corruption is going to rear its ugly head everywhere sometimes, but we do have the power in society to actually make a difference.
Well, and the other thing is, you only get corruption if you report on corruption, and not every government has that reporting process. But I do want to ask you, which countries and which policies have worked to minimize corruption?
Well, generally speaking, anything that increases transparency is good for reducing corruption. You know, there's this expression that sunshine is the best disinfectant. The more that the media can actually focus on and investigate on elected officials, the more open policies are in terms of media access, the better things are. So any policies that open up media access to what's going on in the inner sanctums of government tends to be good for reducing corruption, because ordinary voters like us, like everywhere in the world, despise corruption. We want to see our tax money used for public services, not to enrich politicians or to enhance their electoral prospects. So anything that makes it clearer to us as voters that this corruption is going on and helps us identify the sources of it is, generally speaking, good for reducing corruption.
The report highlights Greece and Spain as one of the bigger problems, and I want you to help us correlate that with the situation with the unemployment there as well, because that's also very high, and I wonder if that demotivates people to look for a job when they feel like perhaps the system is against them or is corrupt.
It's possible. I don't think unemployment in these countries is due largely to the amount of corruption. I think you could say that corruption undermines, to some extent, the effectiveness of economic policy, and to the extent that economic policy is, the quality of economic policy is impinged on by corrupt practices, that could affect the performance of the economy, raise unemployment rates. But I don't think that we can attribute high unemployment rates directly to corruption.
Oftentimes when politicians get into trouble, not necessarily just corruption, it could be any issue they face in office. We look at Italy as an example. Sometimes we look at France as well. A lot of times the citizens will, or the voters will, kind of overlook a lot of problems. How do you relate the two?
Look, this is a very good question, and this is a universal problem. The truth is that everybody's against corruption until your guys or our guys start benefiting from it. Many people in the United States, for example, are in favor of having publicly financed election campaigns. That would get the money out of politics. So the highly moneyed interests wouldn't be able to buy politicians, right? If every political candidate, let's say for president or for Congress, got a dollop of money from the state and was able to use that, then he or she would not be beholden to these big interests. We're all in favor of that. But then when one's own candidate, one's favorite candidate, seems to be fundraising everybody else, then our attitude toward corruption tends to soften. So a fan of Barack Obama in 2008 might be in favor of campaign finance reform that would reduce corruption. But then when we see that President Obama, then Senator Obama, is outraising his Republican rival, our affection for reform tends to decline. So the key to actually really opposing corruption is to oppose it as a matter of principle, consistently, even if you and your guys are benefiting from it.
If only all politicians were this honest. Political scientist and Professor Stephen Fish from the University of California at Berkeley, thank you.
My pleasure.